You'd think the world's oldest murder case would be impossible to solve. It's not. In September 1991, two hikers walking through the Italian Alps looked down into a melting patch of ice and saw a body. Their first assumption was the obvious one: a climber, maybe a few years dead, finally surfacing as the glacier thawed. Mountain rescue was called. A body bag was brought up. Someone even damaged part of the corpse with a jackhammer, trying to chip it free, assuming there was no reason to be careful with it. They were off by about 5,300 years. Once archaeologists got involved, radiocarbon dating placed the body in the Copper Age, somewhere around 3,300 BC, making him one of the oldest naturally preserved human bodies ever found, and by far the most complete. Scientists nicknamed him Otzi, after the Ötzi Alps where he was discovered. And what makes Otzi extraordinary isn't just his age. It's how much of him survived. His skin, his organs, his last meal, his tattoos, even the exact tools he was carrying, all locked in ice for over 5 millennia, essentially untouched. Which means something remarkable became possible. Scientists could run an actual forensic investigation, the kind you'd run on a body found yesterday, on a killing that happened before the pyramids, before writing, before almost anything we consider history. Here's why he survived it all: because it wasn't magic, it was geography. Otzi came to rest in a shallow rock gully, just below a mountain pass. That gully mattered enormously, because it kept his body out of the path of the moving glacier above it, a glacier that would otherwise have ground him to nothing within a few centuries. Instead, in that sheltered pocket, cold, dry alpine air freeze-dried his tissue before snow, and ice sealed him in. For decades, the assumption was that this was a 1 in a billion stroke of luck, a perfect coincidence of timing and terrain that could never happen twice. A more recent re-examination of the site suggests it wasn't quite as miraculous as first thought. His body may have shifted position over the centuries as the ice around him repeatedly thawed and refroze, rather than staying locked in a single time capsule the whole time. Either way, the outcome was the same: a body sealed away by nothing more complicated than cold, wind, and rock for 53 centuries, until an unusually warm year in 1991 finally let it go. Before we even get to how he died, it's worth pausing on who he was, because the level of detail here is almost unbelievable for someone this old. Otzi was around 45 years old at death, roughly average lifespan for the time. DNA analysis shows he likely had dark skin and dark eyes, and was probably bald or balding. He was right-handed. He'd lived his entire life within roughly 60 kilometers of where he died, based on isotope analysis of his teeth and bones. His body carried the marks of a hard life: worn joints, hardened arteries, evidence of Lyme disease, a stomach infection, whipworm parasites, and gallstones. And covering his skin were 61 tattoos, made from tiny incisions rubbed with charcoal, mostly clustered around joints that show signs of wear, which has led some researchers to suspect they weren't decoration at all, but an early form of pain treatment. He was also, by any measure, well equipped for someone traveling through hostile terrain. He carried a copper axe, an extraordinarily valuable object for his time, since copper tools were still rare. He had a flint dagger, a longbow, and a quiver holding 14 arrows. His clothing was a patchwork of stitched animal hides, goat, deer, and chamois, layered with a woven grass cape and cap for insulation. This was not a man traveling light, and not a man traveling by accident. Scientists even know what his final hour looked like. In 2009, after 2 decades of searching, researchers finally located his missing stomach. It had been pushed up under his ribs by the pressure of the ice, nowhere near where his stomach should be. Inside it, they found a full, high-fat meal: dried ibex meat, red deer, and einkorn wheat, along with a trace of a mildly toxic fern that may have been eaten to fight off intestinal parasites. Based on how undigested the meal was, Otzi ate that meal less than an hour before he died. Whatever was about to happen to him, he did not see it coming in time to skip lunch. Now here's the evidence, laid out exactly as investigators found it. Start with the wound that killed him. In 2001, 10 years after his discovery, a routine X-ray turned up something everyone had missed: A small stone arrowhead lodged beneath his left shoulder blade. A CT scan years later showed exactly what that arrowhead had done on its way in. It had torn straight through his subclavian artery, one of the major blood vessels running beneath the collarbone. That kind of injury drops blood pressure catastrophically within minutes. Even with a modern hospital nearby, more than half the people who suffer this exact wound today don't survive it. Otzi was standing at over 3,000 meters of elevation in the Copper Age. He had no chance at all. Scientists confirmed he didn't die instantly, either. They found fibrin, a clotting protein that appears fast at a wound site and breaks down again, just as fast, still present in his blood cells around the injury. That single detail told them he lived long enough after being struck for his body to start trying to heal itself. Someone had also removed the wooden shaft of the arrow after it hit him, leaving just the stone head buried in the bone. Someone was there. Someone did that on purpose. Some researchers have also pointed to a possible head injury sustained around the same time, though whether it happened during the fatal encounter or from the fall afterward is still debated. But the arrow wasn't the first violence Otzi had been through recently. His right hand told a second story. Between his thumb and index finger were deep, jagged cuts, the exact kind of wound you get from grabbing the blade of a knife during a struggle, not from an accident. Crucially, that wound had already started to heal by the time he died, which tells researchers it happened days, not minutes, before the arrow did. Otzi survived one violent encounter only to be killed in a second one. Then there's the blood. Not his own, other people's. Forensic analysis found human blood from 4 separate individuals on his gear. One profile on his knife. 2 different profiles on a single arrow, still sitting and used in his own quiver. One more on his coat. For different people's blood, on one man's equipment, none of it explained and none of it his. And his gear told its own story of desperation. That copper axe was finished and functional, but his bow was unfinished, and several of his arrows weren't fully assembled or fletched. He was carrying tools that weren't ready, which suggests he'd been moving fast, without the time or safety to sit down and finish his own equipment. Everything about his final days points to a man who had been on the run. So here's the sequence forensic scientists have pieced together. Several days before he died, Otzi was in a violent, close-range fight. He grabbed a blade with his bare hand hard enough to cut it open. He may have come away from that fight with someone else's blood on him, or picked it up defending someone, or from a fight involving multiple people, all still debated. Days later, weakened, his gear still unfinished, he climbed high into the mountains, ate a large meal to fuel the effort, and less than an hour later, someone shot him in the back. Now the harder question, not how he died, why? The first theory is that Otzi was a fugitive, fleeing a conflict from his own community or a rival group, cut down before he could escape into the high passes. It fits the physical evidence closest: the earlier fight, the unfinished gear, the exhausted uphill climb, an ambush from behind and below by someone who'd been tracking him. The second theory is that he was a defeated raider or warrior, killed as part of a larger clash between groups, with the blood of multiple people on his gear as evidence he'd been in combat involving several opponents, not just one. This theory shares most of its supporting evidence with the first, and the two aren't mutually exclusive. A personal feud and a wider tribal conflict could easily be the same event seen from 2 angles. The third theory, the most dramatic and the least supported, is that Otzi was a sacrificed leader or chieftain, killed in a ritual context rather than a chase. Researchers who favor this angle point to his relatively high-status equipment, especially that rare copper axe. But it struggles hard against the physical evidence. Ritual sacrifice doesn't typically leave a victim with defensive wounds from days earlier, an unfinished weapon kit, and the blood of 4 different people scattered across his belongings. That's the profile of a man who had been running from something, not a man being prepared for something. The current scientific consensus lands closest to the first 2 theories combined. Otzi was very likely caught up in a violent confrontation, tribal, personal, or both, that started days before his death and ended when someone finally caught up to him high in mountains. Cause of death is about as certain as physical evidence gets. 1 arrow, 1 artery. dead within minutes of a full stomach. Motive, the identity of his killer, and exactly what he'd done to deserve being hunted. That part died with everyone else involved over 5,000 years ago. That's the strange position modern science is in. We know what Otzi ate for his final meal, down to the species of deer. We know what infections he was fighting, what his joints felt like, what his tattoos may have been treating. We know roughly what his last 4 or 5 days looked like, in some places down to the hour. We simply don't know why any of it happened. Every murder needs a motive to actually make sense of it. Otzi's has been gone for 5,000 years, and it's not coming back. All that's left is the evidence, and the evidence is enough to know exactly how he died, without ever knowing exactly why. This isn't the only cold case history has left frozen in place. There are others just as strange, just as well preserved, and just as unsolved, and we'll be going through them one at a time.